I'm pregnant, carrying Victor Song's child. 3 months ago, during a business negotiation, both Victor and I got drunk. Perhaps the atmosphere was too good, or maybe it was just a drunken mistake, but we ended up sleeping together. When we woke up, it was incredibly awkward. Victor and I weren't just boss and subordinate. We were also friends. We've known each other since high school, attended the same university, and after graduation he took over his family's business while I pursued a master's degree. When I finished my studies, he seriously invited me to be his assistant. At that time, he was struggling to establish himself at PR. His previous assistants either had ulterior motives or were spies sent by his uncles. He was fed up, having gone through several assistants, and couldn't trust anyone around him. I wanted to help him, so I accepted the job. Now, this awkward situation has made work difficult, and it might even ruin our friendship. I remember sitting on the bed, clutching the sheets, trying to stay calm as I told him, this was just an accident. We've been friends for too long and we work well together. Losing that over this would be a huge loss for both of us. So we both treated it as an accident. After the initial awkwardness passed, we silently agreed never to mention it again, and gradually returned to our usual dynamic. Thankfully, we were both too drunk to remember the details. This would have remained a quiet, forgotten incident, until I found out I was pregnant. After 3 days of contemplation, I decided to resign. Victor was flipping through the quarterly reports from various departments, not even looking up as he criticized and scolded everyone. He seemed particularly irritable. This wasn't the best time to approach him, so I kept quiet, standing by like a quail, obediently listening to his tirade. Sure enough, his anger eventually turned toward me. You're my chief assistant. I pay you a high salary every month, and this is how you perform. I felt so wrong. Why was he blaming me for the poorly written reports? I was just an assistant. Heaven knows, working for Victor wasn't easy. He was meticulous and demanding, a difficult man to please. Every penny I earned was hard-earned. Besides handling company matters, I had to keep an eye on all the dynamics within the organization and skillfully deal with the troublesome board members. And that was just work. He also had severe OCD and a strong aversion to outsiders entering his personal space. So, outside of work, I had to manage every aspect of his private life. First, there were his female companions. He had a quick turnover rate, and when he broke up with them, I had to step in. Almost every month, I'd sit in a coffee shop, listening to a woman pour her heart out about how much she loved Victor. Sometimes they'd cry. Other times they'd throw coffee at me. I had to remain calm, wiping my face with a tissue while handing over a check, saying, if you're still angry, you can tear this up too. Then I'd kindly remind them, of course, PR never reissues checks or honors any damaged ones. Since becoming his assistant, my phone had to be on 24/7, not even daring to switch to do not disturb mode. So you see, wasn't it only fair that he paid me well? This wasn't easy money, it was blood, sweat, and tears. But never mind, thinking about it now just makes me sad. I let out a long sigh. Victor finally finished reviewing the market report and glanced at me, raising an eyebrow. Why are you still standing there like a pole? Haven't you been scolded enough? I clenched my fists, thinking I'm about to resign, so I might as well be bold for once. I took a deep breath to steel myself. His sharp gaze made me lose my nerve, and I whispered, I want to resign. He slammed the report on the desk, leaned back in his chair, and scrutinized me for a moment before frowning and locking eyes with me. Holy Mary, I shivered under his gaze. He started twirling his pen, a habit he'd had since his student days when he was uncertain or upset. As he twirled the pen, he asked, why? I rubbed my foot against the carpet and said, I'm too tired. I need a break. He scoffed. I'll give you a month. No, 2 weeks off. Is that enough? Fine, 20 days. I closed my eyes, mustering my courage. Victor, I'm pregnant. The pen slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the wooden desk before rolling off the edge. His face turned pale, his mouth agape in shock. What did you say? But he quickly regained his composure, his expression darkening. I could tell he was thinking about that night 3 months ago. I silently watched his face go through a series of emotions before settling on anger. When did you find out? He asked. I didn't answer, but he already knew. Right, 3 days ago when you took a day off to go to the hospital. Then it hit him and he glared at me, his tone harsh. Resign? What's next? Are you going to pull a runaway with the baby move like in those CO novels? Wow, he even knew about those cliched CO novel tropes. Impressive. But honestly, as the eldest grandson of the Song family, I wouldn't dare make such a decision on my own. If Victor found out years later that I'd run away with his child, there'd be no romantic reunion or tearful reconciliation like in those novels. He'd skin me alive. He hated betrayal and deception from those close to him. I didn't even dare hide the pregnancy from him. Back in our freshman year of college, I joined the student council. There was a senior who often bullied me, making me do all sorts of chores like buying her meals and running errands without even paying me back. I was too timid to stand up to her, but somehow Victor found out. He had just finished a gym class and was still holding a basketball. He had no qualms about confronting her even though she was a girl. He hurled the basketball past her ear and it slammed into the wall behind her. Pointing at me, he said, "She's under my protection." Got it. The senior, pale with fear, nodded. I was on the verge of tears, ready to hug his leg in gratitude, but he turned to me, even angrier than before, and poked my forehead. Are you an idiot? Why do you let people walk all over you? Even if you can't stand up for yourself, why didn't you tell me? What do you need to hide from me? What do you need to hide from me? After that, except for one thing, I never hid anything from him again. Honestly, when I found out I was pregnant, I was anxious for a long time. But now that I'd thrown the problem at him, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. I sat back at the conference table, unwrapped a small cake, and watched him pace like a caged animal. The rustling of the wrapper seemed to disturb his thoughts, and he frowned at me. I took a bite of the cake and, rubbing my belly, said, "I'm tired." He choked back whatever he was about to say, clearly frustrated. Seeing him at a loss for words made me secretly delighted. So this was what it felt like to have power through pregnancy. After years of being pushed around, I was finally in control. But I wondered how long it would last. Victor took me to the hospital for a checkup. When I went alone, I was too nervous to pay attention. But this time, with Victor by my side, we both stared at the ultrasound screen like country bumpkins seeing M&Ms for the first time. The doctor pointed out, "It's twins. They're 3 months along and developing well." Twins. I glanced at Victor. He was intently focused on the screen, his long lashes framing his eyes, his jaw tight. I couldn't tell what he was thinking. On the way back, we were both silent. I noticed the tacky piece not hanging from his rearview mirror. I couldn't believe he still had it after all these years. I'd made it for him during our junior year of college. Back then, it was trendy for girls to knit scarves or make bracelets for their boyfriends. In my dorm, everyone except me had a boyfriend, and the whole place reeked of romance. When I went out to eat with Victor, he noticed my gloomy mood and asked what was wrong. After I explained, he laughed and said, "Why don't you just make something for me?" I rolled my eyes. "You wouldn't wear it even if I did. Why waste my time and effort?" He never wore scarves. He sighed. "I don't get you girls. Why do you have to compete over this stuff?" In the end, I made him a piece not because it was the simplest thing. When I handed it to him, I made him promise to keep it for at least 2 weeks. He held it up and asked, "Where am I supposed to put this?" Then he added, "How dare you give me something so ugly?" Later, he hung it in his car. After graduation, when he got a new car, he transferred the piece not to the new vehicle, joking, "I've grown attached to this ugly thing." I laughed. Those memories were bittersweet, but the present was overwhelming. When we reached my apartment, neither of us moved. It was clear this situation had shaken him. He was a man who always had everything under control, and this was something he couldn't easily decide. He gripped the steering wheel, silent for a long time before finally asking, "What do you plan to do?" His tone was the same as during our weekly meetings when he'd point at a proposal and ask, "Do you really think this plan is feasible?" He was the kind of person who always had his own ideas but still asked for your opinion. If you agreed with him, he wouldn't praise you. If you didn't, he'd look at you like you were an idiot and say, "What do I pay you for? To be a mascot." Was there a mascot as miserable as me? I felt like a student who hadn't studied for a pop quiz, unsure of the right answer. I whispered, "I've scheduled an OB-GYN appointment for next week." I watched his fingers tap rhythmically on the steering wheel. His mind was racing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed and said, "Go upstairs for now." A week later, he accompanied me to the hospital, a different one he'd arranged. We sat in the waiting room in silence until a nurse called my name. As I was about to enter the room, he suddenly grabbed my hand. He seemed to have made up his mind. "Would you consider keeping them?" I stared at him in shock. He calmly laid out his reasoning. "You don't plan to marry, and I don't plan to marry anytime soon. We can raise them together without getting married. I'll provide the best for them and for you." Hearing these words from him was astonishing. I knew the weight of his promises. This man, who was always so decisive, stood before me, his head slightly bowed, seeking my opinion. "Of course, it's up to you. I'm not forcing you." I quickly took off the hospital gown and pulled him out of the room. "Fine, Victor. Don't worry, I don't mind if you take the kids and leave me out. After they're born, you can have one and I'll take the other. We'll both be happy. I won't covet your wealth, and if necessary, I'll make sure the child you raise never knows I'm their mother. Deal." My quick acceptance seemed to unsettle him. He muttered, "Something feels off." But it was too late. I pretended not to hear. Modern, independent, and wealthy women often fantasize about having a child without the hassle of marriage or a husband. Victor had good genes and high intelligence, so the kids would likely turn out great. I was satisfied. I was surprised Victor remembered I had no plans to marry. That was a long time ago, during our senior year of college, when my boyfriend of 2 months cheated on me and took all my scholarship money. I was left with nothing. Victor was also going through a tough time back then. He was dating the most beautiful girl in the English department. In all the years I'd known him, she was the only one who truly captured his heart. She was elegant, well-mannered, and spoke softly, often wearing long, flowing dresses. She looked like she'd stepped out of a classical painting. He was so smitten that even holding her hand felt like a privilege. Young love is intense and sincere. Back then, he wasn't the sarcastic, obsessive, and arrogant man he is now. Right after graduation, he took her to meet his older brother, Leon. Leon was a ruthless man. He didn't say much at the time, but 2 days later he sent Victor a package containing photos of her at a bar, dressed provocatively and dancing with various men. He also included a long-term contract she'd signed with someone else. Leon's first lesson to Victor. Always do your research before making a fool of yourself. The other rich kids in Victor's circle mocked him relentlessly. He pretended not to care, but I was the only one who saw how he really felt. His eyes were red as he sat on the field, clutching a beer can, asking me, how could this happen? I wanted to ask the same thing. How could someone who seemed so pure and gentle end up in a bar, dancing with strangers and signing contracts with sugar daddies? But I had also been deceived by a seemingly gentle, scholarly man. Misery loves company, so Victor and I split a case of beer on the field, toasting to our heartbreak. I vowed, I'll never trust men again. Love can go to hell. I'm going to be a rich, single woman. While I became an overworked, sleep-deprived corporate drone, Victor turned into a cold, heartless zoo, surrounded by beautiful women vying for his attention. It wasn't until I started handling his romantic entanglements that I realized I'd been too narrow-minded. Over the years he'd been with all sorts of women, but I never saw anyone like Emily again. I guess he was truly scarred. But enough about the past. Now wasn't the time for nostalgia. After Victor and I signed a contract, we entered a professional partnership, co-parenting. When I went on leave from the company, my entire department clung to me, crying about how much they'd miss me. They were worried about who would bear the brunt of Victor's nitpicking and temper in my absence. They also tried to pry into how I'd managed to get such a long leave, hoping to learn my secret. It was a tough secret to share. Holding my files, I solemnly replied, seduction. They scoffed, dismissing my answer because even if I had seduced Victor, they'd think I was the one taking advantage of him. It was strange. Victor had been linked to many women, but when it came to me there wasn't even a hint of scandal. Once out of curiosity I asked my colleagues why. They didn't even look up, replying dismissively, don't joke, Hannah. Who had stood by Victor through thick and thin as he rose from an intern at PR to its CEO. Who had pulled all-nighters with him to meet deadlines. Who had shielded him from the board's predatory members. It was me and only me. Victor himself sometimes remarked, Hannah, you're like a brother to me. Fine, a brother. I just hoped he'd go easy on his brother, and stop calling me at 3 a.m. to unclog his shower drain because some woman's hair had blocked it. My friendship with Victor had started oddly, but over the years he'd come to see me as family. I saw him as, well, never mind. Our bond was pure and could withstand any test. In high school I was a chubby girl. When we were assigned seats in our sophomore year I ended up next to Victor. I sat on the outside and every time he needed to leave he'd say impatiently, hey chubby, move. It was hurtful, but I didn't dare complain. Back then Victor was the school's golden boy, smart, handsome, and from a wealthy family. He had a gang of friends and was the center of attention wherever he went. His constant chubby remarks might not have been malicious, but others took it as permission to bully me. I became a shy, insecure girl who secretly cursed Victor in her heart. Things changed during a gym class. We were doing sit-ups and Victor had to hold my legs. He finished his set easily, but I struggled after just 3, gasping for air and wriggling like a worm. The boys around us started laughing and one shouted, is she a pig? I burst into tears. Through my tears I saw Victor stand up and yell at the boys, who's laughing? The laughter died down and he came back to hold my legs, saying impatiently, why are you crying? Just do it. He didn't press down hard, and when the teacher wasn't looking I managed to do a few more. He counted for me, 3, 7, 8, 12, 14, 18, 23, 30. Good, you passed. At that moment I thought, he's not so bad. I'll stop cursing him in my heart, We became closer in our senior year. Once he skipped class and a physics quiz was handed out. He didn't return before the quiz was due, so I filled it out for him. The teacher was strict, and anyone who didn't turn in the quiz would have their parents called. I whispered to him, don't worry, I filled it out for you. He wasn't afraid of much, but he dreaded having his parents called. Especially his brother Leon. He was surprised, then smiled and nudged me. Thanks, chubby. I corrected him sternly, I'm not chubby. I'm Hannah. He laughed even harder. Okay, thanks, Hannah. I decided not to argue. Somehow we became friends. In our final semester I asked him which university he wanted to attend. He boasted, the best one, of course. Then he pinched my chubby cheek and said, you should aim for the same school, Hannah. Then you can keep helping me with my homework. The thought of that future was bleak. I didn't want to go to the same school or do his homework. I was sure his habit of skipping class would prevent him from getting into a top school, so I studied hard. By the time exams were over, I'd lost 35 pounds. When the results came out he texted me to ask where I'd gotten in. When I told him he called immediately. Not bad, Hannah. You can keep helping me with my homework. My heart sank. Victor often said he felt comfortable around me because I wasn't pretentious. Most girls tried to act refined in front of him, but I didn't. When we went out to eat, I'd devour a plate of chicken feet or pork knuckles in front of him. No other girl would eat like that in his presence, so he often remarked, it's most relaxing to be with you. Being relaxed made our relationship comfortable. We always considered each other friends. Or rather, he saw me as family. Neither of us could have imagined that one day, I'd be having his children. If someone had told us that a year ago, we'd have sent them to a mental hospital. It was just too strange. At first, neither of us could get into the role. After I went on leave, I stayed home to rest. It felt so odd because I didn't feel pregnant at all. I had no experience and didn't know what pregnancy was supposed to feel like. But with my 3-month-old twins, aside from a slightly larger belly, I had no symptoms. I felt so normal that Victor and I often forgot I was pregnant. Once Victor came over after work. He sprawled on the couch like a king and ordered, "Why isn't there any fruit? Go wash some. And I'm starving. Make me some ribs." Fine. I washed the fruit and started cooking the ribs. Halfway through, the kitchen light went out. My old apartment had outdated fixtures and I'd been meaning to renovate, but work had kept me too busy. I found a light bulb in the drawer and climbed onto a chair to replace it. Victor, drawn by the smell of cooking, wandered into the kitchen. Startled by his shadow, I lost my balance and nearly fell. He caught me just in time, but I felt a sharp pain in my stomach. I looked at him wide-eyed and said calmly, "I just remembered, I'm pregnant." He nodded, equally calm. "Right. I just remembered too." We switched places and I watched from the doorway as he rolled up his sleeves to replace the bulb. Victor, who had aced physics in school, struggled with the simple task. After several failed attempts, he looked at me sheepishly and said, "You should move in with me. This place is unsafe." Victor's home had a full-time housekeeper and was spacious and comfortable. I smiled and declined. "That might not be a good idea. What if you bring a woman home? It'd be awkward." He glared at me, pinching the bridge of his nose in frustration. "I won't." "Great." I agreed cheerfully and immediately started packing. "Wait," he called out, pointing to the ribs on the stove. "Bring those. I haven't eaten all day. I'm starving." So, with the ribs in hand and Victor carrying my suitcase, I moved into his luxurious penthouse, beginning our cohabitation. By the 5th month, I finally felt pregnant. My belly had grown significantly and I developed a voracious appetite. I wasn't picky, I craved sweet, sour, spicy and bitter foods. My mouth was never still. Sometimes, Victor would look at me with concern as if I were a pig being fattened for slaughter. My sleep schedule also flipped. I was wide awake at night and drowsy during the day. The first time the babies kicked was at 3 a.m. At first, I didn't realize what was happening, but when the movements grew stronger, I jumped out of bed and rushed to Victor's room. Since we'd started living together, he kept his door unlocked in case I needed help at night. I burst in, turned on the bedside lamp and shook him awake. "Victor, wake up." He'd only fallen asleep at 1 a.m. after working late. Groggy and irritated, he glared at me. This better be important. Ignoring his mood, I placed his hand on my belly. "Do you feel that?" The babies kicked again and Victor's expression shifted from confusion to wonder. We stared at each other, grinning like fools until the moment grew awkward. The soft glow of the lamp cast a warm, intimate light. His hand remained on my belly and we were close enough to feel each other's breath. For a moment, he looked almost childlike, his usual sharpness replaced by pure curiosity. I suddenly felt nervous and stood up, stammering, "Go back to sleep." "Oh, I'll leave." He nodded, pulling the blanket up. "Yeah, okay." It was so embarrassing. I buried myself under the covers and poked my belly, whispering to the babies, "Behave, you two." As my pregnancy progressed, I realized I was becoming more attached to Victor. I often found myself thinking about him. When we worked together, we spent almost every waking moment side by side. Now being alone at home felt strange. This wasn't a good sign. I ran into Emily again at the hospital. Emily was the English department beauty who had shattered Victor's heart. I was sitting on a bench in the hospital lobby, waiting for Victor to get my checkup results, when I saw him walking down the escalator with Emily. I can't describe how I felt at that moment. Emily was as stunning as ever, her long black curls cascading over her shoulders, her figure accentuated by a sleek black dress. They looked like a perfect couple, their beauty making everyone around them fade into the background. I stared, forgetting to compose myself, until Victor's gaze swept the lobby and landed on me. He smiled faintly and mouthed, "Good girl." Emily followed his gaze, her cat-like eyes shifting from my face to my protruding belly. She smirked disdainfully before turning back to Victor with a charming smile. "I won't disturb you two. Let's catch up later." I was too distracted to notice Victor's reaction. Later, back at home, Victor went over the doctor's report and pregnancy precautions with me. I listened half-heartedly, never asking the question burning in my mind. Asterisk, why did you meet Emily again? Do you still have feelings for her? Asterisk, that night I dreamed of our college days. I was holding the clumsily made peace knot, nervously waiting for Victor outside his dorm. As the streetlights flickered on, I saw him returning hand in hand with Emily. She leaned against him, the picture of a perfect couple. Anyone would say they were meant to be. My unspoken confession died in my throat. Yes, I had loved Victor. In high school, I'd worked tirelessly to get into the same university as him. I'd lost 35 pounds to feel more deserving of him. I had loved him so much that I wanted to have his children. He probably never imagined that his brother had been secretly in love with him for years. But I couldn't tell him. In college, I hadn't had the chance. Now I couldn't find the words. The nightmares left me restless for weeks. To pass the time I called my colleagues. They complained about Victor's harshness and mood swings, but then their tone shifted. Hannah, we think the boss might be seeing someone. My interest piqued. Was it Emily? Mina whispered conspiratorially. Last week when the boss was working late, Hope went in to deliver dinner. She saw him on a video call. That's not the interesting part. She heard a woman on the other end asking when he'd be back and saying she wanted food from that private kitchen in West Garden. And the most interesting part? When Hope walked in, he hung up immediately. He must be seeing someone. Who else could boss him around like that? I hung up feeling guilty. That someone was probably me. After 6 months, my cravings became more specific. I went from eating anything to rejecting almost everything. The expensive nutritionist Victor hired couldn't satisfy my palate. I'd never experienced morning sickness before, but now I was vomiting constantly. The nutritionist urged me to eat for the baby's sake, but I could barely keep anything down. Victor, however, wasn't having it. He glared at the nutritionist and said calmly, "I hired you to care for her, not force-feed her." His words weren't harsh, but the nutritionist looked terrified. I tugged at Victor's sleeve, explaining it was my fault. One night, while Victor was working late, I couldn't sleep. Out of nowhere, I craved the food from West Garden. It was an exclusive private kitchen, known for its small portions, high prices, and impossible reservations. I'd once booked a dinner there for Victor and his then-girlfriend, but she'd received her breakup check before the date. Victor had been abroad at the time, so I'd eaten the entire meal myself. Despite the small portions, I'd left unsatisfied. The bill was astronomical, but thankfully it wasn't my money. At the time, I hadn't thought much of the food, but that night, the memory of its taste overwhelmed me. So I called Victor. An hour later, he was home with food from West Garden, despite their no takeout policy. He watched me eat, concerned. "Is it enough? If not, I can have their chef cook for you at home." But I quickly grew tired of it. Pregnancy seemed to bring out a new level of patience in Victor. One night at 4 a.m., I suddenly craved the fried rice cakes from our university's street vendors. The crispy exterior and soft interior, coated in a special chili sauce. It was unforgettable. Back in college, whenever Victor skipped class to play games, he'd bring me 2 rice cakes on his way back. It was one of his few considerate gestures. But that was years ago. Victor had just returned from a business trip, jet-lagged and exhausted. The chef at home tried to recreate the dish, but it wasn't the same. Overwhelmed by hormones, I started crying. Victor, who had been sleeping lightly since my pregnancy, heard me and came out. He found me surrounded by plates of rice cakes, tears streaming down my face. He turned to the nutritionist. "What's wrong?" I looked up at him pitifully. "Victor, do you remember the rice cakes from our university?" He sighed deeply, grabbed his coat and said with a mix of resignation and fondness, "Let's go. We'll drive there and arrive just in time for lunch." So, with the driver at the wheel and Victor dozing in the back, we traveled hundreds of miles for rice cakes. We arrived at the university gates at dusk, just as the vendor was setting up. I watched the rice cake sizzle in the oil, my mouth watering. I grabbed 2 and turned to find Victor leaning against the car, his eyes closed, dark circles under them. The bustling street was filled with students, their youthful energy palpable. The golden light of dusk bathed Victor, softening his sharp features. For a moment, he looked almost gentle. My heart raced and I couldn't move. Victor opened his eyes, his dark gaze locking onto mine. He smiled teasingly. "What, don't want to leave? Should we hire the vendor?" I looked away, muttering, "It's not me. It's your son." Right, he agreed without hesitation, then chuckled. "It's just rice cakes. Why were you crying?" I didn't answer, biting into the rice cake. Tasted just like I remembered, crispy, soft, and flavorful. As I ate, I felt like I was consuming my own hidden, unspoken feelings. He asked, "What's wrong? You look so serious. What are you thinking about?" I glanced at him but didn't reply. Some things are better left unsaid. When we got back, he splashed cold water on his face and returned to work. I stared at him from across the room, wondering why he was being so good to me. Was it just because I was pregnant? But from high school until now, I'd always been an exception in his life. Did he know that? How did he really see me? As a brother? But he was too focused on his work to notice my thoughts. I sighed and he suddenly looked up, catching me staring. I quickly averted my gaze as he ordered, "Hannah, check my phone for the verification code." I picked up his phone, but before I could find the code, a text from an unknown number caught my eye. Victor had never kept secrets from me, so I opened it. The message read, "Victor, it's Emily. Do you remember me? Victor's reply was brief and businesslike. "Yes. Do you need me to refer you to someone? Emily, 137986, rich, gullible, no quirks." I burst out laughing, startling Victor. "What's so funny?" "The code. The code." I laughed so hard I could barely breathe. He scolded me, "Be careful. Don't laugh too hard or you'll hurt your stomach." The weight in my heart lifted instantly. I looked at him sincerely and said, "Victor, you're a good person. The rice cakes were delicious." He eyed me suspiciously as if expecting me to ask for another favor. He didn't respond. Typical man. I met Leon when I was 8 months pregnant. By then, my belly was enormous and every movement was painful. Leon walked in while Victor and I were arguing over the remote. Victor wanted me to watch prenatal classes, but I insisted on watching Legends. It was a fantasy drama starring the famous actor Chin and his wife, who had once been PR's global spokesperson. After their marriage, she hadn't renewed her contract. When I first started watching the show, Victor had given me a strange look. I asked if he'd like Chin, hence the long endorsement. He rolled his eyes and explained, when the show was first pitched, the female lead wasn't cast. After she was, many investors pulled out. The funding gap was huge and the project was almost scrapped. My brother stepped in to cover the shortfall. He added bitterly, he even used another company's name so she wouldn't know. I immediately understood. Chin was beautiful but often dismissed as a talentless actress. In this show, however, her performance was impressive, likely thanks to her husband's coaching. I'd met her during a promotional shoot. She was gentle and approachable. I hadn't realized she'd had a history with Leon. It was bittersweet. Because of this, Victor wouldn't let me watch Legends. The song men were so petty. That day, Leon's secretary, Zeus, entered first. I'd met Zeus a few times before. When I first became Victor's assistant, I'd struggled, and Leon had sent Zeus to guide me. Later, we'd even gossiped about Leon together. He was a terrifying man, not in appearance as the Song family was blessed with good looks, but in demeanor. His methods were ruthless. When the Song parents died in an accident, greedy relatives tried to seize the family's wealth. Leon, only a high school freshman, raised his younger brother Victor while reclaiming control of PR. He'd tamed the board and expanded his empire in the US financial markets. After Victor graduated, Leon handed PR over to him, only occasionally checking in. Victor feared no one but Leon. When Victor first joined PR as an operations director, the board members didn't take him seriously. He maintained a calm exterior, but I knew the pressure he was under. He'd often come to my school for lunch, get drunk, and ask, "When will I be like my brother?" A single glance from Leon could make anyone tremble. Now, Victor had achieved that level of authority, but I knew Leon would always be his benchmark. In recent years, Leon had stepped back from the spotlight, rarely involving himself in day-to-day affairs. When Zeus appeared at the door, Victor and I exchanged a look of dread. My belly was impossible to hide. Zeus glanced from my face to my stomach, giving me a sympathetic look. Second young master, Mr. Song, is on his way. Leon sat on the couch while I sat across from him. Pregnancy privileges. Victor wasn't so lucky. He stood by my side, bravely taking the blame. "Brother, this was all my idea." Leon ignored him, focusing on me. He'd clearly done his research, so he cut to the chase. "What are your plans after the child is born?" I looked at Victor, signaling him to answer. He gestured for me to speak. I stammered, We plan to co-parent without getting married." Leon raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "That's not an option. A Song child cannot grow up in such an unstable environment. If you don't plan to marry, then after the child is born," he looked at me, "I expect you to leave and never appear before the child again. PR is no longer a suitable workplace for you. I hope you understand." Victor stepped forward. "Brother." But Leon wasn't open to negotiation. As he stood to leave, his gaze flicked to the TV screen, which was paused on a scene from Legends. The female lead, played by Chin, looked up at the male lead with tear-filled eyes, her expression heartbreaking. Leon stared for a moment, his usual composure slipping. I caught a fleeting glimpse of sorrow in his eyes. It was strange. A man who seemed to have everything still carried such regret. I should have listened to Victor and watched the prenatal classes. After Leon left, Victor and I stared at each other, both feeling hopeless. Neither of us had expected things to escalate like this. I scolded him, "What's the use of you? You couldn't even keep this from your brother." He glared at me, about to retort, but then glanced at my belly and held back. Pregnant women ruled the roost. In the past, I wouldn't have dared to speak to him like that. I sighed deeply. Victor, worried about my mood, reassured me, "Don't worry. We'll figure it out after the baby's born. I'll handle it." But what could he do? One look from Leon and I'd probably go into labor. Fortunately, the birth went smoothly. A month before my due date, I checked into the hospital. Victor worked from the delivery room. When the contractions started, I was eating a peach. I calmly kicked Victor and said, "It's time." He turned pale, panicking. "It's time? But it's not the due date yet." He pressed the call button for the doctor, running around like a headless chicken. You'd think he was the one giving birth. Unlike him, I finished my peach before heading to the delivery room. I had a natural birth that turned into a C-section. It was risky, but everything went well. Before I passed out, the doctor smiled and said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Song. You have a healthy pair of twins." I smiled, too tired to correct him, and then the anesthesia took effect. When I woke up, Victor was by my side. Two swaddled babies lay next to me. They were wrinkled and ugly, and I couldn't help but exclaim weakly, "Why are they so ugly?" Victor didn't agree. For the first time, I saw him smile so warmly it was almost unsettling. He gazed at the babies lovingly. "They're beautiful." Then he looked at me, his eyes glistening as if he might cry. I hadn't even cried yet. What was with him? Was he forgetting his usual cold demeanor? I stared at him warily as he took my hand, his voice soft but determined. Hannah, let's get married. What? The golden light of sunset streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. I asked weakly, is this your idea of a proposal? He nodded, kissing my hand. Will you say yes? I wanted to ask if he loved me or even liked me. If he didn't, how could we marry? But he kissed my hand again, his tone solemn. Hannah, I'll take care of you and the children for the rest of our lives. Let's try building a family together. I wasn't sure if this was just a spur-of-the-moment decision, fueled by the emotions of seeing his children for the first time. He held my hand, his eyes filled with nothing but me. In that moment I gave in. Thought *, why not? Life is long and we have plenty of time to learn to love each other. Or at least for him to love me. *. It wasn't impossible, was it? This was my only chance. I needed to be brave. I nodded, looking at him, and suddenly felt like I was back in high school. It was during a gym class just like this, with the golden light of sunset around us. I was doing sit-ups and he stood against the glowing sky, counting for me. 3, 7, 8, 12, 14, 18, 23, 30. Good, you passed. The feelings I'd hidden for so long had finally come to light. And now, against all odds, they'd been fulfilled. Mrs. Song. I like the sound of that.